working for famous architects. It's fun. Just like anything out there, it has its really amazing positives and challenging aspects of that kind of job. Got a chance to work for David Adjaye at Adjaye Associates in London during my first year past my postgraduate studies at the Architecture Association. So this was mid-2013 to late 2014. It was a very fulfilling job. It was, again, my first job after my postgraduate studies. Prior to that, I have had some other jobs after graduation, but this was in 2009 and we were dealing with a whole other crisis back then, which may actually look really tiny compared to the crisis that's going to come up now. When I worked there, I was in a really low salary. Adjaye Associates, they tend to pay quite lower than they should pay, but people really want to work there. Who wouldn't want to work for a famous architect? Hey, I definitely did. I wanted to learn from the best, right? So what better way to learn than go and work somebody's office for dirt cheap, you know? I know in Japan, hopefully they stopped that, but people had to pay to get internships, right? In some ways, unfortunately, the industry is still set up based on exclusivity. You actually have to be able to afford to work at some architectural places because you have to have enough money to sustain yourself beyond what you get as salaries. And that's in like the lower levels, you know. Once you get to a certain level, you could make a decent salary, but prior to that, how do people live? I don't know. So that's kind of how it was like for me. But luckily my wife was working at the time. She had a pretty good position, making pretty much twice as much as I was making starting out there. But that's only one aspect of it. And I don't want to talk about the salary, but I do want to talk about it as a grand scheme of things, of understanding what the experience of working for a famous architect is like. So I got interested by David Adjaye by seeing him at a lecture in Princeton. I think it was in 2007, 8 or 9, I can't really remember. But it was quite refreshing to see somebody that was talking for both scales, because he showed a really massive project, Sokolov Business School in Moscow, and a really tiny project, which I can't even remember what it was called, and just exposing the scale between those two elements. I remember with my 3 good friends, we went to see it and we were having a very lively discussion back to Philadelphia. For those of you that don't know, Princeton to Philly is about an hour and a half drive, depending on traffic. Fast forward to 2013, after I graduated from the AA, I took some time off. Definitely needed. It was a very intense program. We all worked our behinds off. Spent a month in Bali, spent some time with my parents and just working and visiting friends in the US. Then came back, started applying for jobs, and I landed a job with David Adjaye. It was crazy because I went there at the first day of the interview. They really needed people to work, so I started pretty much the same day, if not the day after. So when I was there, I worked on a few projects. One of them was a competition for really high-end resi in Beirut. And the project that I worked much longer on, it's actually already being built. It's headquarters for Goldman Sachs in London, and we were taking a small part of it. We were looking after the auditorium and the dining hall facilities. Based on the client's word, one of the partners from Goldman Sachs, from the development side of the company, said it was like the gem in the overall development. Huge building, 1 million square feet of office space, pre-Brexit, pre a lot of things, 2013, very optimistic times. People thought they need a lot more office space. Yeah, wow. How much the world has changed in 7 years. Crazy. It was a great project. Working there was really challenging in many other ways though. I worked very hard, very hard. Probably left between 9 and 10 on average. At least once a week I worked very late until 2, 3 a.m. and cycled back work. I had to balance that with something. This was before having kids. So I started doing Ashtanga yoga. And the funny thing is I was super regular at it when I had that super intense schedule. I knew I had to do that because otherwise I would have gone crazy. Now I'm crazy because of the kids, but before that I would have been crazy just because of work. So work-life balance was definitely tricky. You know, it was work here, life down here. And I noticed that with most architecture companies in New York and London, you do tend to have kind of a lack of balance between work and life. Some more famous architectural practices that do have a good balance between work and life tend to be positioned in countries that generally do respect a better work and life balance, like Sweden and Switzerland. So I'm thinking about Snøhetta at Herzog and de Meuron. I know people that have worked in both offices in different studios throughout the world, and they're pretty happy with the work-life balance. And to me, that has to do with the country of origin. So if your office is set up in the UK or the US in New York, you know that people go in those cities mostly to really work, not live, even though we need to live to work, or live to work, work to live, I forget what it was. Anyways, I think you get my point. If you come to work in London in a Starchitect studio or New York in a Starchitect studio, you're going to be working pretty hard. So that was exactly my experience at the Adjaye's office. And you know, I have friends, colleagues that have worked throughout different places within London. And you know, it doesn't matter if it's Zaka Studio, Foster's, Rogers, Hedderwick, you do tend to work pretty intensely in all of those places. Not during the whole time, but especially when we were starting out, everybody was working super intensely. So what about the day-to-day? So we already know work is pretty intense, and there are all kinds of different projects. So there are competitions, many competitions that come through the door. They tend to be a bit more distinctive. So not too many mixed use or hotel, but there was an office competition during my time that was there. And then also a lot of cultural competitions like museums, memorials, and so on. I know David Adjaye has been a partner for a quite controversial Holocaust museum just behind Westminster. I don't know why it's so controversial. It's a green space, but people think there shouldn't be anything built. But anyways, Adjaye Associates in London tends to have a relatively high turnover rate, which I don't think is very different than other Starchitect practices like Hedderwick, for example. Few people stay on for a very long time, few more people stay for a bit less time, and many people stay for quite a short time. And because of that exchange of employees consistently, if you start in a project and that project tends to run for a bit longer, by the end of the project, you'll probably be already managing it. The corporate structure is pretty flat. We have David Adjaye, and then we have the local director, and then we have a couple of other junior directors below the local director, but generally those directors and everybody else in the office, which are all very talented people, they tend to be within the same pool of people. And so the structure is pretty flat. You know, anybody could really lead a project, or anybody could kind of be responsible for part of the project. And yeah, basically if you stay long enough, which is about a year, even less, then you most likely are going to be managing a project. Now this was in 2013 and 14, so things may have changed a little bit since then, or they may not have. I have no idea, because most of the people that I do know, they don't really work there anymore. So in day-to-day, we're dealing with the client, we're dealing with the local director in the office, and we do have an occasional email with David Adjaye. Now he's a busy man. He was pretty much crisscrossing the globe on a monthly basis during my whole time at the office, and he would come in the London office maybe once in 2 weeks and spend an afternoon meeting the different teams and going through different designs. He would usually come in for important client meetings and then stay on to discuss some important parts of the project. So David really cares about the projects, but more in a holistic way. He didn't really care about every doorknob or which way the door swings everywhere, but he cared about the overall expression. And that's really his input in all the projects, was what do we want to express and how do we stay succinct to the idea. The office's job is to realize David's visions. So we were there almost as a backbone. I don't want to say that critical thinking wasn't important, because it definitely was, but some decisions we couldn't really question like you would be able to question in a university setting or in other types of offices. In there you kind of had to take it as it came, because there really wasn't the opportunity to challenge some things. That's not to say that there isn't a creative input, because we had to think about how a specific element could be designed in a way that could actually get built on a relatively budget way, even though budget didn't matter, because most of the clients that went to work with David Adjaye, they wanted to work specifically with David Adjaye. They didn't want to work with somebody that gave him the lowest bid or had the most experience in hotel design, for example, residential design or office design. They wanted to work with somebody because they kind of appreciated his vision and his understanding of the projects, looking back at his portfolio, or maybe even during a chat or a conference or a lecture or keynote at the university setting. And that's kind of really unique because it allows you to kind of position yourself based truly on your visions without focusing too much on all the other aspects that need to take your price down, as an example. So those conditions made for super interesting projects throughout the office. Again, work was hard, but the projects were amazing. And if you're lucky enough, you actually got to manage a job without much experience. If you stayed there for like 2-3 years, you were managing really awesome and amazing projects, which I can't say for other companies that I worked on because they have a very clear hierarchy. You know, they're larger offices. At the time I was at Adjaye, it was about 36 to 40 people. It varied a little bit. And the other offices, you know, they were much larger. I worked at AHMM, which is 250 people. Now HOK, which is 170 people. And in both of those office settings, there's a very clear hierarchy. You can only do so much within kind of your bubble, unfortunately. Whereas the flat structure of Adjaye's office allowed you to kind of go well above and beyond that. Everywhere you can overproduce, which is, I think, a tendency for architects everywhere. To me, it has to do with the way that we are taught at universities. We're always taught to overproduce no matter what, without kind of setting like clear boundaries of what needs to happen. But in some practices, that overproduction amounts to nothing. In other practices, that overproduction actually amounts to some realization. So hard work, underpaid, some management skills, but really cool projects. That's how I would sum up my whole experience at Adjaye's office. So the project that I worked on there the longest was an auditorium for Goldman Sachs, as I mentioned earlier. Now, it's pretty much built and it looks pretty much exactly the way we designed it, and that's amazing. I can't really say the same for many other projects that I worked on, that they're actually going to turn out exactly how we designed it. I wasn't at Adjaye when we were doing design development and having mock-ups and everything, but I designed sort of the ceiling and the overall arrangement. It was actually when I learned Grasshopper as well, so it was a very important part of understanding how to manage that data for the auditorium and design it as efficiently as possible. The working environment is also pretty cool. It's actually maybe because David Adjaye is of African origin, but the office is the most diverse office that I have worked on or been at meetings at. Adjaye's office, I mean, it attracts the most diverse crowd. Now, what about quality control? Quality control is quite important in there in regards to producing good quality drawings, 3D images, and so on. And that's really important because in other places, I feel like the directors or managers have been a little bit too nice to staff, perhaps including myself, to explain what needs to be done to make an okay drawing to an amazing drawing, and that extra effort that's required. There weren't those kinds of boundaries at Adjaye, but that's also good because it kind of made the work quite good. It wasn't just okay, you know, we weren't just putting whatever we wanted on the page. We really had to work hard to make good drawings. In that respect, it was a little bit more like university than it was like some of the other companies that I've worked with or collaborated with, because you see a drawing and you're like, what in the world is this? The other really cool thing about Adjaye's office in London is that it's only 10 minutes away from Hyde Park, so I was having loads and loads of walks to Hyde Park, looking at the ducks, looking at the lake, which took my mind completely off of work. And that's probably my favorite thing about London. I've always worked relatively close to kind of a green area or an escape area from the everyday hustle and bustle of the city. So at Adjaye I had Hyde Park. Then when I worked at AHMM, their office is in Old Street. It was very close to the Barbican and to Regent's Canal. Really nice places to visit. And working at HOK, Regent's Park was also a 10-minute walk, so definitely gave an escape, even though in the last years I did get a little bit too intense with work and didn't enjoy the park. And now, well, we're enjoying home, right? I mean, yeah, it's got to be a different world. I can't even picture what it's like going back to the office just yet, because yeah, I mean, we're home. Anyways, working at famous architects' offices, I feel like they're more or less two camps. They're the younger and the up-and-coming guys with small offices, and then they're the super established architects with larger offices. So the smaller offices, they really tend to have strong control, right? You have the king or the queen and everybody below them. You have to listen to exactly how the king and the queen communicate. It's not a democracy. It's definitely not a democracy, right? It's definitely king-queen type of situation. But at some point, the kingdom gets a little bit too big. And in a big kingdom, you need a couple of people to help with the everyday management. So Zaha, for example, and Foster's and even Rogers are example of that. At some point, Zaha Hadid Architects became too large, and Zaha, when she was alive, and Patrick, they couldn't look after every single project. So they made a hierarchical structure where they had directors, and each one of those directors, they had responsibility for their own projects, including aesthetics. Now, the aesthetic ethos of all the projects still need to adhere to the company design language, but there was still a little bit more freedom. You could all of a sudden have those critical thinking skills, not only for construction and for execution, but also for design methodologies dissipated around. And it's sometimes a good thing, sometimes not so good thing. I haven't worked at Zaha, so I can't really comment on that, but I know the kingdom. And Hedderwick, I don't know what it's like now, but 5 years ago when I used to have friends working there, it was a very similar situation. Hedderwick, in fact, was in the office much more, as far as I know, than David, and he really got involved with the projects. Foster's, it's a huge office, is the biggest office in the UK, it fluctuates, it's probably a little bit lower now, but at one point it was over 1,000 people. It's impossible for one person to look after the projects of 1,000 people, which, let's say, maximum 10 people working per project, which is very optimistic. There were 100 projects at any point. I really can't look at all of those projects. So Rogers, I think he was in the early 2000s, set up a similar situation where a lot of the senior guys that have been in the office for a bit longer became partners. But some people don't want to grow big. Like Adjaye's office has been, I think, around 30 to 60 people consistently. And offices open and close. I know the Manhattan office is still around, and the London office is definitely still around, but there used to be a Berlin office and an office in Ghana, in the capital of Ghana, Accra. That's where David's family is from. And those offices don't work anymore, although I think the Accra office may or may not open up again. They kind of fluctuate a bit. And between all of those, it's kind of still a boutique sort of organization, in the sense that it doesn't have a highly corporate structure, very flat. Everybody's more or less even, besides the local director and David Adjaye. Programs that we use in there, well, the programs you use everywhere. At the point, the main program was Vectorworks, but now I know the office uses AutoCAD and of course Revit, because you have to use Revit unfortunately everywhere. Photoshop, SketchUp, Rhino, Grasshopper, you name it all. It really doesn't matter. What I discovered in my experience is if I have some good skills with specific software and find in whatever way to integrate that with the rest of the team, then everybody's happy. Thanks for watching and see you next time.